Thanks for having me. And thanks to David Spread for the great motivation of my talk. So I don't need to talk about why we need to act. We agree on that very much. So I will maybe not so much take a versus stand on the collapse, but hopefully more a complementary one, although I do think we have a lot of discussion points coming up. So my work really has focused a lot in the past on thinking about how to design a global governance system for carbon prices in order to reach the Paris climate goals, which we've just seen being criticized. Here I'm taking into account incentives of different actors and also equity issues. And this is what my talk will be about today. So if we take the Paris goals at face value, this is a representation, very rudimentary one, of the general structure of the challenge that we're facing. So here you see yearly CO2 emissions until the end of the century, and pathways when we do not act, business as usual, and then those deep decarbonization scenarios here, reaching the temperature targets of the Paris Agreement, 2 degrees Celsius and 1.5 degrees Celsius stabilization. And as you know, we need to peak soon. This is a representation here where the peak has happened in 2020. And then over the next decades, 2 decades, that we see steep emission reductions here going towards carbon neutrality in the second half of the century. Now, in order to achieve that, what we need to do here is redirect investments away from fossil fuels into efficiency solutions. So really moving away from investing, as we're doing still today, into carbon intensive production technologies. Then in just a few decades, the power sector will have to be decarbonized completely. So this is really important as the power sector is the one which we will rely on for the next emission reductions that come thereafter, those last 10%, which are really challenging to decarbonize here, because for a carbon neutral economy, lots of the end users will have to be electrified. And here we face huge challenges in freight transport, aviation, shipping, heavy industry, and of course, agricultural emissions. What I want to emphasize here is that the technologies we need for our economies to work in this way are not available yet, at least not at large scale. And this is then where the market forces really come into place. And especially then as we move towards the end of the century, where we're really looking towards net removal CO2 emissions from the atmosphere to compensate residual emissions and to compensate budget overshoot, where we want to cool the atmosphere, as David Spread has been talking about. And also these technologies right now are not available, for sure not on a large scale, they're in testing mode. So we need to move ahead here. And here is where we can use the market system and capitalism to make this happen. So emission-wise, due to COVID, we're on track for peaking in 2020 right now. Let's see how that goes after the pandemic is done. And this also is an opportunity for us to use the COVID recovery packages that come up anytime we've passed the situation here, to take into account climate change matters and redirect investments that are going to happen then and induced by policy towards a more carbon-friendly development trajectory. And here, my argument is that carbon pricing is a prerequisite for that. I'm not saying it's the only instrument, but what it does is it makes carbon activities less attractive. And this is really what we need to achieve a sustained reduction in emissions. Now, the important part here, where we want to make use of the capitalist market, is that such a carbon price will spur innovation. And we need lots of innovation for our economies to work, to produce welfare for all of the people that live in the 21st century, and to be happy and live a free life. Here, the carbon price is an instrument to shift innovation towards the technologies that we need. As an economist, I of course have to emphasize that carbon pricing is cost effective, which is good property to have, as these deep decarbonization scenarios will be very costly. So we want to save on costs where we can. An additional benefit here is that it generates revenues. And here, what I want to do now is, with these carbon pricing and the generated revenues, I want to focus on how we can achieve a system of carbon pricing and transfer such that this transformation here becomes ambitious, more ambitious than the one that we have now, and equitable. And here the transfers will play a critical role in my argument. Now let's look at the challenge here in terms of the carbon pricing level then. This is a picture here from the IPCC that shows what the price level is that we need in order to transform the economy. And you see here, as we go towards these very ambitious stabilization scenarios, we already need a price today of around $50 per ton of CO2, and then rising over the century really to very high levels, where at the end of the century we have these carbon prices of over $1,000 per ton of CO2 to ensure that the technologies that we need in order to decarbonize really become profitable. Now, having a system of carbon prices in place is not just a theoretical argument, but it makes use of the fact that carbon pricing or CO2 pricing is increasingly used around the planet. So this makes economists, of course, very happy here that this first best instrument that we recommend in order to regulate externalities is also something that is increasingly used around the globe as actually implemented policies, and then also as being scheduled for implementation in large parts of the world in the future. Now, a criticism that often comes around when talking about carbon pricing is the doubt that it actually reduces emissions, because it's sort of termed as a marginal instrument. Now, what I would like to present is sort of a review of the literature on all of the studies that have been performed that show the effectiveness. I can't do that right now. Here's where academics has to step up and present more of these types of analysis. But this is here anecdotal evidence where, for example, the Swedish carbon price, which is very high, being implemented has led to a large decrease in emissions from the heating and transport sector, where it has been implemented since 2005. We've seen 20% decrease in emissions in the sectors where the policy was implemented. There are other examples from Switzerland and British Columbia where we had such a high carbon price, and this has really led to a large reduction in emissions over time. And hopefully this is what we will see now in Germany with the new carbon price we've implemented for the transport and heating sector, where in these sectors we've actually observed an increase in emissions over the last years, and where now a carbon price has been put into place, and where we will see hopefully emission reductions in the future. Now, looking at the carbon price level, there are some examples around that have very high carbon price. We've just seen the Swedish tax. There's the Swiss tax here that is already at these transformative levels that we need for the challenge ahead. And then we have a lot of initiatives where the price is at least significant. Recently, the EU ETS has stepped up here. And but of course, what you see here is that only few countries have high ambition, and most countries, not in the list here, do not have a carbon price. And this is where the challenge now comes in, and what is frustrating as when you work in climate change, that why do we lack this ambition and what can we do about it that ambition becomes higher, carbon prices are increased in their level around the globe. And this is sort of the challenge here at a glance that also David Spread has already been talking about. So what you see here are the carbon budget for 2 degrees Celsius scenario and the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario. And then we have the goals of the countries that they have pledged to do under the Paris Agreement with the nationally determined contributions. And what you see here is, as David Spread was already saying, these are not enough. Until 2030, we've basically used up the entire budget for the 1.5 degree scenario and a large part of the budget for the 2 degree scenario until the end of the century. And so carbon prices here need to rise to make the policies consistent with the targets. And I want to talk about how can we complement the Paris Agreement and our current way of cooperating on this challenge in order to increase prices over time. And here, from my point of view, why are we not acting even though we have face these existential risks, is that we were facing here a global public goods problem at a scale that we've not seen before. And this is really hampering. So what you see here is the schematic illustration of how the nationally determined contributions come in within the Paris Agreement. So we do have these top-down ambitious temperature targets, well below 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees. But then the Paris Agreement relies on voluntary contributions to achieve these objectives. And we only have informal mechanisms blaming countries for their low ambition as punishment and incentives here. And so the question is, how can we develop complementary institutions to ramp up these voluntary contributions that address the free riding incentive? And for me, the free riding incentive is at least one of the core issues that prevents higher carbon prices from being achieved. Because what can countries do? They can rely on other countries to reduce their emissions more quickly and remain on a carbon-intensive development path, because the global climate is only determined by aggregate emissions. And here is what economic research has shown to sort of represent the danger of the Paris Agreement within this public goods game. So what you see here is lab experiment where people have played such a public good game as climate change is, and they decide how much they want to contribute to the public goods, reducing emissions voluntarily. And what research has shown here is that a large part of the people are willing to cooperate. So they start out with giving a lot of contributions to the public good, but then they observe that others didn't contribute, and then free riding really kicks in, and they see that they're being exploited by others, and then total contributions go down as they also start to give less. And so here, from a behavioral economics point of view, the research has shown that a large group of people are conditional cooperators. So they will cooperate if you cooperate. And then a sustained conditional cooperation then needs to take advantage of that people are willing to cooperate, even in the face of high free riding incentives, if they observe that others cooperate as well. And so the question is, how do we get Paris there? How do we get countries to be conditional cooperators and therefore sustain global cooperation? And here is where, in a paper with Ottmar Edenhofer, I made I presented an idea of how one could do that. So how can you ensure that countries step up in emission reductions and increase their targets? And the main idea here is that, well, first of all, countries should introduce carbon pricing. Why? Well, we've already talked about all of the benefits from carbon pricing from an economic point of view. But really what's crucial is that the carbon price is really a measure of ambition of the country, because it says how much pressure is put on the economy to reduce emissions, irrespective of the development path that this country is on. So do we have developed countries or developing countries? And now this introducing this carbon price, as we've seen, alone doesn't do the job. We have to have high carbon prices. And now what prevents countries, of course, from implementing higher carbon prices is that their costs rise with that. And so they have a disincentive to ramp up their carbon price on their own, because they face high costs versus not so high benefits if the other countries do not increase their carbon price as well. And so what we introduce as an idea here is to use climate finance and transfers in a strategic way. That means that countries, as they ramp up their carbon price, receive a higher transfer. And this then increases their ambition as it offsets the individual costs that they have. This is the case whether countries are recipients or donors. So if they increase their individual carbon price in their economy, they will either receive more transfer if they're recipients, or pay less of a transfer if they're donors. Of course, as this is a global game, we have to ensure that transfers add up to zero. And this we do here in a system that establishes transfers, that establishes cooperation by basing the amount of transfer on compensating differences in mitigation costs. So the central element here is that transfers are conditional on the carbon price level. And now, if you increase your transfer, you raise your costs in comparison to the average among all countries, and therefore receive an incentive to increase your carbon price. And this happens for all of the countries as you anticipate that you only have to pay a fraction of the additional costs as you raise your carbon price, as the rest is compensated through transfer payments. We show here in this paper that free riding is addressed, voluntary targets are ambitious, and countries receive an incentive to also participate in such a scheme of transfers that mitigates differences in mitigation costs between countries, because all of the countries that are part of this transfer scheme ramp up their ambition and conditional cooperation is implemented. All right, so this is how carbon prices can be designed in conjunction with transfers to ramp up ambition in this public goods game. Of course, what we don't necessarily require here is that carbon prices have to be equal between countries. And I think this is really a crucial point where economists maybe have been hammering too much that we need a global uniform carbon price. And this may be something where countries are objecting towards because we have such large inequality in the world. And so as transfers ramp up ambition, we might still make use of differentiated carbon prices to reflect equity issues. And here is a scenario done at the Potsdam Institute, where they show how such a system of convergent carbon prices over time, but starting out with differentiated carbon pricing, could look like as we move towards the 2-degree climate target. Now, what is important here as we move towards a uniform global carbon price is that transfers here ensure that we implement equity issues between countries and therefore compensate those countries that have a lower level of development through transfers as they need to ramp up their global carbon price towards a uniform one. So this is the question at the international level. And what I also look at is at the role of carbon pricing at different levels. So going from the international level to the national level, and how carbon pricing here needs to be designed to reflect equity issues, and what can be done in order to ramp up ambition and ensure a acceptable carbon price at the national level. And here, the climate finance setup of the Paris Agreement can be used in order to make the transformation also equitable at the national level. So what Paris has promised is a transfer of $100 billion from 2020 on, from developed to developing countries, and has established a couple of multilateral funds to ensure that these transfers are flowing here. Now, a problem of what the climate finance here at the international level faces is that most of these transfers are project-based. So they're very local projects that lead to emission reductions that are then financed by this climate finance. And this has been criticized in the past a lot for lacking additionality and lacking effectiveness. And so our proposal here says that this should be done alternatively. As said, the climate finance should rather finance the introduction of some sort of form of carbon pricing at the national level. And the international finance here can be used to build up capacity and provide compensation for incremental costs of introducing the price. And now what's crucial is that as countries introduce carbon pricing in their economy, they generate revenues that can then be used to finance local projects or compensate especially affected groups. And this is really a huge advantage of carbon pricing, that it, in conjunction with leading to emission reductions, is a source of revenue that then can be used to alleviate equity issues and development issues. And here's an example of the current, the introduced carbon price at the German level, where we have a 25 euro per ton of CO2 carbon price implemented in the transport and heating sector. And what the analysis here on the right-hand side shows is that the burden from having such a carbon price really distributes differently across the population. So we have a regressive effect here happening from carbon pricing in the electricity sector, affecting mostly poor parts of the population, as they have a higher share of electricity in their expenditure, while emissions from heating and transport here in the direct sector have a U-shaped curve, where the largest burden is put on middle-income countries. And now what Germany has done is it's used its carbon price revenue to mitigate some of these distributional consequences by having a higher or a changed way of the Pendlerpauschale, where commuting is subsidized here in Germany. And this is really a critical point to introduce effective carbon pricing, to take into account these distributional consequences. And this can easily be done with a carbon price using the proceeds. Okay, with that, I'd like to wrap up here. So I think we all agree that the challenge is unprecedented, And what we need is invent not only technologies, we need to invent new institutions, new ways of cooperating, new policy instruments to achieve the transformation that is needed. What I try to argue here is that increasing carbon prices is a prerequisite for the Paris goals. It's not the only instrument we will need, but it really is essential in driving the transformation. And then what we can do in order to face the challenge of free riding incentives and mitigate it is using transfers in a strategic fashion to ramp up ambition between countries. And here, the transfers can then be used to address equity concerns between countries and within countries. And we can use differentiated carbon pricing in the same way to address these equity concerns. Yeah, and with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I'm looking forward to the discussion.